They said his skin was the wrong color to hold a weapon. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. When Japanese planes attacked, nobody cared what color he was anymore. A cook who wasn't allowed to fight became the most lethal man on his battleship. The Navy gave him a medal, then tried to forget his name. This is the story they buried.
Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. The morning sun rose over Oahu with the kind of crystalline clarity that photographers pray for. Light dancing across the Pacific in patterns that made the water look like hammered silver. It was Sunday, the one day of the week when Navy personnel could sleep late if duty allowed, when the pace of military life slowed just enough for men to write letters home or play cards in the barracks or attend services at the base chapel. On the USS West Virginia, a battleship moored along Battleship Row in the harbor, most of the crew was still below decks, some sleeping off Saturday night shore leave, others preparing for the day's light duties. In the ship's galley, a 22-year-old mess attendant named Doris Miller was collecting laundry, his official duty in a Navy that allowed black sailors only the most menial positions, regardless of their capabilities or aspirations. His shipmates called him Dory, a nickname he'd carried since childhood in Waco, Texas, where he'd been born the son of sharecroppers, who worked land they'd never owned for wages that barely sustained life. Dory had joined the Navy in 1939, seeking opportunity that didn't exist for black men in Depression-era Texas, hoping military service might offer training and advancement that the Jim Crow South actively denied to anyone who looked like him. He'd scored well on the Navy's aptitude tests, showing particular aptitude for mechanical systems and problem solving, the kind of scores that would have qualified a white recruit for training as an engineer or gunner, or any of the technical specialties the modern Navy desperately needed. But Navy regulations in 1939 restricted black sailors to the messman branch, a segregated division created specifically to ensure that African Americans remained in servant roles, cooking and cleaning and serving white officers, perpetually subordinate regardless of ability or ambition. The official justification, stated plainly in Navy documents and repeated by officers who believed it without question, held that black men lacked the intelligence and emotional stability required for combat positions, that they would panic under fire and endanger their white shipmates, that centuries of slavery had somehow bred out the courage and capability that military service demanded. These assumptions were presented as scientific fact, backed by racist pseudoscience that measured skull sizes and created intelligence tests deliberately designed to confirm predetermined conclusions about racial hierarchies. Dory accepted this restriction the way millions of black Americans accepted countless daily humiliations in a country that claimed to value freedom while systematically denying it to anyone whose ancestors had been enslaved. He collected laundry, served food, cleaned officers' quarters, performed every menial task assigned to him with the quiet competence that white supervisors interpreted as natural servility rather than professional discipline, born from knowing that any mistake would be attributed not to individual error, but to racial inferiority. He watched white sailors with less intelligence and worse work ethic receive promotions and training opportunities that would never be offered to him. Watched them learn gunnery and navigation and engineering while he scrubbed floors and hauled garbage. The unfairness of it burned in ways he couldn't express to white officers who would have interpreted complaints as insubordination. But he channeled that frustration into excellence at whatever tasks were permitted, into physical training that made him one of the strongest men on the ship, into observing everything around him with the acute attention of someone who knows that official channels will never teach him what he needs to learn. He paid particular attention to the ship's weapons, watching gun crews during drills with the focused intensity of someone studying for an exam he'll never be allowed to take. He memorized the procedures for loading and firing the anti-aircraft guns, understood the mechanical principles that made them function, knew the timing and sequences that transformed raw ammunition into defensive fire. The gun crews never acknowledged his presence during these drills, never imagined that the black mess attendant watching from a distance was absorbing their training with better retention than some of the white sailors officially assigned to those weapons. When officers passed Dory in the corridors, they saw a servant, a functionary, someone whose existence mattered only insofar as their meals arrived on time and their quarters remained clean. They didn't see intelligence or capability or the kind of courage that combat would soon demand, because their assumptions about race made those qualities invisible in anyone who looked like him. At 7:55 a.m. on December 7th, Dory was in the midst of his morning routine, gathering laundry from officers' quarters in the deck below the main deck, when the first Japanese bomb struck the USS Arizona moored nearby. The explosion was unlike anything he'd experienced, a physical force that rattled the ship's entire structure and sent him stumbling against a bulkhead. For a moment, there was confusion, the kind of disorientation that comes when reality shifts too quickly for understanding to keep pace. Then the general quarters alarm began screaming, and men started running toward their battle stations, and Dory understood with the terrible clarity that sometimes accompanies catastrophe that his ship was under attack, and that the training exercises he'd watched from the sidelines had suddenly become desperately real. He ran toward his assigned battle station in the ammunition magazine, moving through corridors that were filling with smoke and the acrid smell of burning oil, passing sailors who were struggling into clothes or grabbing helmets, or simply trying to understand what was happening. The ship shuddered again as another explosion hit somewhere above, and the lights flickered and went out, plunging the interior passages into darkness broken only by emergency lighting that cast everything in hellish red shadows. Dory reached the ammunition handling room to find it already flooding, seawater pouring through ruptured hull plates where a torpedo had torn the ship's side open like paper. The compartment was waist-deep in water that was rising visibly, and men were abandoning the position because staying meant drowning in darkness as the ship settled deeper into the harbor. He reversed direction and headed up, climbing toward the main deck where at least there would be air and light and some chance of survival if the ship sank. The climb took him through scenes of chaos that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. Men trapped behind doors that had been warped shut by explosions, screaming for help that wouldn't come in time. Wounded sailors bleeding from shrapnel wounds, some missing limbs, some burned so badly their skin had charred black. The smell of burning flesh mixing with oil smoke and cordite in a nauseating combination that made breathing an act of will. Bodies floating in flooded compartments. Men who'd been killed instantly by the torpedo's blast wave or drowned when water rushed through ruptured hull sections faster than they could escape. When Dory emerged onto the main deck, he found himself in the middle of a naval battle that looked like a vision of the apocalypse. The entire harbor was under attack by Japanese aircraft that filled the sky like a swarm of mechanical insects, dive bombers and torpedo planes and fighters that strafed anything that moved. The USS Arizona was burning, a pillar of black smoke rising hundreds of feet into the air from fires so intense the ship's ammunition magazine would soon detonate in an explosion that would kill over 1,000 men in seconds. The USS Oklahoma had capsized, her hull visible above water like the back of a dying whale. Men trapped inside, pounding on the steel, trying to get out before they drowned. Bombs were falling everywhere, creating geysers of water when they missed, and terrible flower-shaped explosions when they found targets. Shrapnel singing through the air like deadly rain. The West Virginia was listing heavily to port from the torpedo damage, settling lower in the water with each passing minute, and men were abandoning ship on the captain's orders. But others were staying to fight, manning the anti-aircraft guns that represented the ship's only defense against the aircraft that were systematically destroying the Pacific Fleet. Dory saw an officer he recognized, Lieutenant Commander Dwar Johnson, struggling to reach the bridge, wounded and disoriented. He moved to help, getting under Johnson's arm and half carrying him toward relative safety, ignoring the bullets that were stitching lines across the deck from Japanese fighters making strafing runs. He got Johnson to cover and then kept moving because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant confronting the absolute terror of being on a sinking ship under attack by an enemy that controlled the sky. He found himself near the bridge, where the ship's captain had been killed by fragments from a bomb that had hit nearby. Officers were trying to organize damage control and direct defensive fire while also processing the shock of losing their commander. And in the chaos, Dory saw something that would change the course of his life, and eventually contribute to changing the course of American history. One of the ship's 50 caliber anti-aircraft guns was unmanned, its crew dead or wounded or simply gone, the weapon sitting silent while Japanese planes flew overhead with impunity. Every instinct and regulation said that Dory Miller, a black mess attendant, had no business touching that weapon, that it wasn't his place or his responsibility or his right. But men were dying all around him, his ship was sinking, and there was a weapon that could fight back if someone would operate it. He moved to the gun without conscious decision, muscle memory from watching countless drills taking over where official training had been denied. His hands found the grips as if they'd done this 1,000 times. His eyes picked up the lead angles he'd memorized from observing gun crews. His mind processed targeting calculations he'd absorbed through sheer force of attention. A Japanese dive bomber was lining up for another attack run on the ships moored nearby, and Dory tracked it with the gun, leading the target the way he'd seen done in drills, squeezing the trigger when the geometry felt right. The gun roared to life, tracers arcing through the smoke-filled air, and the bomber exploded in midair as his rounds found the fuel tanks or ammunition or some other critical system. The aircraft tumbled out of the sky trailing fire and crashed into the harbor in a spray of water and debris. He didn't have time to process what he'd just done, didn't have space in his mind for the significance of a black sailor downing an enemy aircraft while white officers watched in shock. There were more planes coming, more targets requiring the defensive fire that the gun could provide if someone was willing to operate it. He kept firing, tracking targets and leading them, and squeezing off bursts that sent tracers streaming toward aircraft that had moments before seemed invincible. Some of his shots missed, the targets too fast or too far, or the lead angle wrong, but others connected, and he saw planes hit and smoking and losing altitude, pilots trying to regain control of damaged aircraft or simply trying to get far enough away to crash somewhere that wouldn't kill them instantly. The historical record isn't entirely clear on exactly how many planes Dory Miller shot down that morning. Official Navy accounts credit him with shooting down 2 aircraft and damaging several others, but the chaos of battle makes precise accounting impossible, and some witnesses claim the number was higher. What's undisputed is that he operated that anti-aircraft gun with effectiveness that matched or exceeded trained gunners, that he did so without having received any official training on the weapon, and that he continued firing until the gun ran out of ammunition and the order came to finally abandon ship. By that point, the West Virginia had settled onto the harbor bottom, sitting in the shallow water with her decks awash, fires burning in multiple sections, over 100 of her crew dead and many more wounded. Dory helped evacuate wounded sailors, moving through smoke and fire to reach men who were trapped or injured, or simply too shocked to save themselves. He pulled men out of burning compartments, administered first aid with supplies he found in damaged medical stations, organized groups of survivors to help each other off the sinking ship. The official after-action reports note his actions helping wounded crew members with the same bureaucratic language they'd used to describe inventory management, clinical descriptions that completely fail to capture what it means to move through fire and smoke and death to save people while your ship is sinking and enemy aircraft are still attacking. He worked until there was no one left to save, until the officers ordered him off the ship along with the other survivors, until he found himself standing on the dock watching the West Virginia burn and settle, and join the other shattered vessels that littered Pearl Harbor. The attack lasted less than 2 hours, but it killed over 2,400 Americans and wounded more than 1,000 others, destroyed or severely damaged 8 battleships and numerous other vessels, and brought the United States into World War II. In the immediate aftermath, as the military tried to process what had happened and organize rescue efforts and account for casualties, Dory Miller returned to doing what he'd been trained to do, what Navy regulations said was his proper role. He helped establish emergency feeding stations for survivors, cooked meals using whatever supplies could be salvaged, cleaned and organized and served, making himself useful in the ways that mess attendants were supposed to be useful. He didn't talk about manning the anti-aircraft gun, didn't claim credit for shooting down aircraft, didn't draw attention to having violated the regulations that restricted him to menial service. But others had seen what he'd done. White officers and sailors who'd watched a black mess attendant operate a weapon he'd never been trained on with effectiveness that shamed some of the men who'd received months of official gunnery instruction. Their reports filtered up through the chain of command, creating a problem that military bureaucracy wasn't designed to handle. Acknowledging Dory's actions meant acknowledging that a black sailor had performed with courage and capability that Navy doctrine claimed was impossible, that the racial restrictions keeping African Americans in servant roles might be based on prejudice rather than legitimate assessment of ability. Ignoring his actions meant denying the reality that witnesses had observed and that military honor theoretically required recognizing. The compromise that emerged from this institutional tension was typical of the way America has always handled challenges to its racial hierarchies, recognizing exceptional individual achievement while carefully preserving the systems that created the exception's necessity. In May 1942, 5 months after Pearl Harbor, Dory Miller was awarded the Navy Cross, the service's 3rd highest decoration for valor, becoming the first African American to receive that honor. The citation praised his distinguished devotion to duty, extraordinary courage, and disregard for his own personal safety, and specifically mentioned his actions manning the anti-aircraft gun and helping wounded crew members. Admiral Chester Nimitz personally presented the medal in a ceremony aboard the USS Enterprise, and the Navy's public relations apparatus promoted the story as evidence of American democracy and opportunity. proof that even the son of Texas sharecroppers could become a hero if he demonstrated sufficient courage. What the official narrative carefully avoided mentioning was that Dory Miller remained a mess attendant after receiving the Navy Cross, that the same Navy honoring his courage continued to deny him access to the training and advancement that white sailors received as a matter of course, that his heroism had earned him a medal, but not the right to serve in the combat positions where that heroism could be properly utilized. He was promoted to mess attendant first class and then to cook third class, advancing within the segregated messman branch, but never escaping it, never receiving the opportunity to become the gunner. His actions at Pearl Harbor proved he could be. The Navy wanted to celebrate his individual achievement while maintaining the systemic discrimination that made that achievement remarkable, wanted to use his story for recruitment and morale, without actually changing the policies that relegated black sailors to servant roles. Dory became famous, his photograph appearing in newspapers and magazines across America, his story told and retold as inspiration for a nation mobilizing for total war. But the fame sat uneasily with him, this quiet man from Texas who never sought attention and who understood that the celebration of his individual heroism was being used to deflect attention from the continued oppression of millions of African Americans in uniform and out. He went on war bond tours, giving speeches that Navy public relations officers wrote for him, shaking hands with politicians who praised his courage while voting to maintain segregation, smiling for photographs with white officers who would never consider him an equal, regardless of his decorations or demonstrated ability. In interviews, he was unfailingly modest, deflecting credit and insisting that he'd just done what needed doing, that any sailor would have done the same in his position. This modesty was partly genuine character and partly survival instinct learned from growing up black in Jim Crow America, knowing that claiming too much credit or showing too much pride could be interpreted as uppity by white authority figures who had the power to destroy him. When reporters asked if he'd been afraid during the attack, he admitted the fear but described it in matter-of-fact terms, as if being terrified while your ship sinks and enemy planes strafe the deck was just another day's work. When they asked if he thought his actions might lead to changes in Navy policy regarding black sailors, he gave carefully neutral answers that expressed hope without criticism, supporting integration without condemning segregation, navigating the impossible balance that black Americans have always been forced to maintain when speaking to white audiences about racial injustice. Behind the public relations facade, Dory continued serving on active duty, assigned to various ships and shore stations, performing the mess duties that Navy regulations said were appropriate for someone who looked like him. He never received formal gunnery training despite having proven his capability under the most extreme conditions imaginable. He never served in combat positions despite holding the Navy Cross for valor. The fame he'd gained at Pearl Harbor created a protective barrier that made the Navy cautious about assigning him to dangerous postings where his death might create unwanted publicity, but that same fame made him too valuable as a symbol to waste in roles that might actually utilize his demonstrated abilities. In 1943, Dory was assigned to the USS Liscum Bay, an escort carrier that was part of the force attacking Japanese-held islands in the Central Pacific. On November 24th, during operations near the Gilbert Islands, a Japanese submarine torpedoed the Liscum Bay, hitting the ship's bomb magazine and triggering a catastrophic explosion that tore the vessel apart and sent it to the bottom in minutes. Of the ship's crew of nearly 900 men, only 272 survived. Doris Miller was not among them. He was 24 years old. The news of his death was reported in newspapers across America, mourned by the black community that had celebrated him as a hero and symbol of what African Americans could achieve when given the opportunity, mourned less publicly by the Navy that had used his story for propaganda while maintaining the policies that restricted him. He was gone, killed in action like thousands of other sailors, his potential and capability and courage extinguished by the same war that had revealed those qualities. The official notices described his death with the same bureaucratic language they used for every casualty, name and rank and date. Clinical documentation that captured none of the tragedy of a life cut short or the bitter irony of a hero dying while still denied the opportunities his heroism should have earned. In the decades after his death, Dory Miller's story has been told and retold, interpreted and reinterpreted, used to support various narratives about race and military service and American opportunity. The Navy that refused to train him as a gunner, despite his demonstrated ability, has named ships in his honor, including the aircraft carrier USS Doris Miller, commissioned in 2030. Streets and schools and buildings bear his name. Historians debate the exact number of planes he shot down and the precise details of his actions that morning at Pearl Harbor. But focusing too much on those details risks missing the larger truth that his story reveals about American institutions and the cost of discrimination. Doris Miller proved at Pearl Harbor that the assumptions justifying racial segregation in the military were lies, that black sailors could perform under fire with the same courage and capability as anyone else, that skin color had nothing to do with the qualities that combat demanded. But that proof didn't immediately change Navy policy, because the segregation wasn't actually based on honest assessment of ability. It was based on white supremacy that no amount of evidence could quickly overcome. The same Navy that celebrated Dory's individual heroism continued restricting black sailors to mess duties for years after Pearl Harbor, maintained segregated units and limited opportunities, and all the machinery of institutional racism that Dory's actions should have discredited. Full integration of the U.S. military didn't come until 1948, when President Truman signed Executive Order 9981, desegregating the armed forces, and even then implementation took years and faced resistance from officers who preferred familiar prejudices to the complications of actual equality. Dory Miller didn't live to see that integration, didn't live to see black sailors serving as gunners and pilots and officers, didn't live to see the Navy that had restricted him to collecting laundry finally acknowledge that talent and courage don't correlate with skin color. He died serving a country that had never given him full citizenship, fighting for freedoms he'd never fully enjoyed, defending a democracy that had systematically excluded him from its promises. His story matters not just as inspiration, but as indictment, revealing the cost of institutional discrimination measured in wasted talent and squandered potential and lives cut short. How many other Dory Millers were there? Black sailors who could have been excellent gunners or pilots or engineers if they'd been given the training and opportunity that white mediocrity received automatically. How many died collecting laundry on ships they could have defended more effectively if the Navy had valued ability over racial hierarchy? How many innovations and insights and acts of courage were lost because the people capable of providing them were told their only value was serving food and cleaning quarters? The gap between Dory Miller's demonstrated capability and the opportunities he was permitted reveals everything wrong with judging people by characteristics irrelevant to their actual abilities. He learned to operate an anti-aircraft gun by watching, absorbed complex procedures through sheer attention and intelligence, then executed those procedures under the worst possible conditions, and did so more effectively than many sailors who'd received formal training. That should have immediately qualified him for gunnery school and combat positions, should have prompted the Navy to recognize that they were wasting talent by maintaining racial restrictions. Instead, they gave him a medal and kept him in the galley, celebrated his individual achievement while preserving the system that made that achievement exceptional rather than routine. The tragedy isn't just that Dory Miller died young, though that's tragedy enough. The tragedy is that he died without ever being allowed to fully use the capabilities he possessed. That a nation that desperately needed every bit of talent and courage it could muster chose to waste both because of prejudices that had nothing to do with military effectiveness. The tragedy is that his story had to be exceptional, that a black sailor operating an anti-aircraft gun during an attack was newsworthy rather than routine, that doing his duty under fire earned him fame because Navy policy said men who looked like him couldn't be trusted with weapons or responsibility. We remember Doris Miller as a hero, and he was. But we should also remember him as an indictment of systems that create artificial scarcity of opportunity, that reserve advancement and training for people who meet arbitrary demographic criteria rather than demonstrated ability. His heroism reveals not just his individual courage, but institutional failure, not just what one man accomplished despite obstacles, but what a nation lost by creating those obstacles in the first place. Every time we celebrate his actions at Pearl Harbor, we should also acknowledge that he proved black sailors could serve in combat roles in 1941, and the Navy didn't fully integrate until 1948, and thousands of black servicemen spent those intervening years relegated to positions that didn't utilize their full capabilities because changing policy apparently mattered less than maintaining racial hierarchies. The sailor who manned the gun he'd never been trained to use and shot down enemy aircraft while his ship sank deserved better than a medal and continued segregation. He deserved the training and opportunities and respect that his actions proved he'd earned. He deserved to live past 24, to see the integrated Navy his heroism helped create, to serve in positions that matched his demonstrated abilities rather than the limitations that racial prejudice imposed. That he received none of those things, that he died still restricted by policies his courage should have destroyed, tells us something important about how slowly institutions change and how high the cost of that resistance falls on the people those institutions claim to serve. Doris Dory Miller's story is American history in microcosm, the gap between stated ideals and practiced reality, the cost of discrimination measured in individual lives, the slow, painful progress toward treating people based on their capabilities rather than their appearance. He was a hero not just for what he did at Pearl Harbor, but for doing it despite every obstacle a racist system could place in his path, for maintaining dignity and competence while being denied basic respect, for proving truths that authorities refused to acknowledge until politics and public pressure finally forced change. That's the story worth remembering, worth telling, worth learning from. Not just one man's courage, but what that courage revealed about the institutions that tried to deny it, and the long struggle to make those institutions live up to the principles they claim to embody.